Okay, so this, as Miyajima Sensei said, this is a paper or presentation with the title Voice Through Divestment, and it's joint work with Annette Pajust and Anna Toniolo. So what is the paper or the presentation about? Well, it's about divestment, and it really is about a puzzle. So what's the puzzle? If you look around today in the economics and finance literature, you will find that most of the colleagues are opposed in some form to divestment. And they have very good arguments. So the first line of argument states that when you divest, if your purpose is to push down the price of the divested companies, that is actually not very effective, so the price impact you're going to have is very limited. If you are thinking about voice, so voting or engagement, there's a contradiction as well, because once you've divested, you've sold the shares, and you can no longer vote them. So if you want to persuade people to change their ways on fossil fuels, well, how do you do this if you've divested? On the other hand, there are more than 1,552 institutions as of yesterday who have made divestment pledges, and I'll show you more about the list of who these are. So there is a clear contradiction between what finance scholars think is effective and what these institutions are actually doing. So something's kind of got to give, because either they are completely wrong or there is something missing. So that's what the paper is about, and I propose that the finance literature has kind of missed a trick, because it's overlooked that the fossil-free divestment movement is not really about price pressure, and it's not really about engagement. It's about a narrative. It's a social movement, and it uses a moral outrage narrative in order to put pressure on everybody to do something about the fossil climate problem. And I'm not only going to argue that, but I'm going to show you some evidence that what the movement is about, it's about threatening the license to operate, and that actually it does have impact on behavior of these companies, and it does have impact on the markets, and it does have impact on governments. Now, if you believe what I'm going to present to you, or some of the results I'm going to show to you, actually today, this movement was started in 2012. Today, 10 years later, it's actually already come a long way. And I'll show you some arguments that actually, from the standpoint of today, where we are, it's actually no longer a narrative, a moral outrage narrative, but it's actually become rational for investors who might not have a moral compass at all to actually divest from fossil fuels, or at least to commit to conditionally divest from a purely financial risk management perspective. So that's going to be the closing loop. So the outline, what's the outline of the talk? Well, first of all, I'll tell you about economic narratives in case you haven't seen that, which is Schiller 2017. I'll then explain the narrative to you. What's the narrative about? I call it the 350 carbon budget divestment narrative. I'll then show you evidence of the footprint of the movement on the by now infamous Twitter. And then I will show you more about the divestment pledges database, so these 1,552 pledges that I mentioned before. And finally, I'll show you some impact on how these pledges went viral on Twitter and what the impact on stock prices has been. And then there'll be summary and conclusions, and then hopefully, especially after the discussion, we will get to talk about what the implications are for Japan. So let me get going with the economic narrative. So in case you don't know this literature or this book, it's a book by Robert Schiller about economic narratives, where he basically argues that stories and narratives are important in driving economic events, and that these have been largely overlooked by economics and finance, although narratives are quite a well-studied proposition in other fields of the social sciences. So what is a narrative? So he gives you, Bob Schiller gives you a very useful definition. So he says it's a simple story or easily expressed explanation of events that many people want to bring up in a conversation or news or social media. It usually has some human interest, either direct or implied. It maintains a core contagious element, and when an element is contagious, it may even go viral. And he uses not Twitter, but something else to measure virality. And then finally, mutations in narratives spring up randomly. So that's broadly the definition. So a narrative has a core, it's persuasive, people like to talk about it, but not everything about the narrative necessarily needs to be true. And it, by people talking about it, actually has an impact on economic phenomena. So I'm going to try and persuade you that the fossil fuel divestment narrative is actually fits Schiller's definition. So what is the narrative? Well, it's actually very simple. So it really goes back to an article by Hansen published in 2008, which is the original piece that put forward the fact that we have to stay within 350 particles per million ppm in the atmosphere if we want to stay below, if we want to keep living conditions the way they have been in the past and that have made us prosperous and the planet livable. At the time of publishing, we were already beyond 350 ppm, and today we are even further. So this graph from 350.org, which was named after the inside of 350 ppm, shows you very clearly what we need to do. We are over 350 ppm if we want to stay within the limit, certainly 1.5 degrees centigrade. We have to come back to 350 ppm. Now, then another idea came into the narrative a bit later, and these people said, well, 350 ppm, that's how much you have in the atmosphere, but what do you actually need to do? Well, you have to say how much carbon have we burnt already and how much carbon can we still burn? And then they came up with this notion of a carbon budget. And you can see here on the pie charts, if you want to stay within 1.5 degrees centigrade with a 50% likelihood, we have 380 gigatons of CO2 left to burn. And we've burnt most of it already. So then it's not difficult to understand what we actually need to do to stay within the carbon budget. We basically can't burn what we already have. So we must stop exploration. We must stop not just exploration, but actually extraction of fossil fuels to stay within the carbon budget that will keep us within these temperature limits. So the science wasn't hard to understand. And then in July 2012, Bill McKibben, who's a very well-known climate activist, he wrote it all up in an article published in no other place than Rolling Stone magazine. And you have this illustration from Egil Rodriguez, who likes to design covers for Der Spiegel and other magazines. So a very powerful image here for bringing the message across. And what did Bill McKibben say? He basically, and I commend this article to you if you've never read it, do read it. It's very good, very persuasive. So Bill McKibben basically goes through the arguments and the efforts that people have made, and he is very skeptical about the various solutions, whether it's what people have tried before in finance or even government. And then he says, at this point, effective action would require actually keeping most of the carbon the fossil fuel industry wants to burn safely in the soil, not just changing slightly the speed at which it's burned. So this is what I told you before about the carbon budget. And then he says, so pure self-interest probably won't spark a transformative challenge to fossil fuel, but moral outrage just might. And that's the real meaning of this new math, the carbon budget. It could plausibly give rise to a real movement. And then this is his idea. This is the idea that he puts forward of what the movement should do and look like. He says, once in recent corporate history, anger forced an industry to make basic changes. That was the campaign in the 1980s demanding divestment from companies doing business in South Africa. So this is his proposal of what a solution should look like. Now, did that take off? Well, yes, because students in the US took this up, and you can see here how I think it was the New York Times had a story entitled "The Divestment Brigade." So to stop climate change, student aims at college portfolios. And note where I put the blue arrow, it wasn't about, they did not talk about putting price pressure on companies or anything like that. They said they wanted to put this on the national political agenda. So this was the idea. What did they ask for? Well, they wanted all fossil fuel investments, or to be, wanted to stop all fossil fuel investment. However, they thought that that was not realistic. So they started with a list of companies that matter most, which is the 200 publicly traded companies that control the oil, coal, and gas that's still under the ground. And what you need to do if you want to stay within the carbon budget, you've basically got to stop this being extracted. So then they compiled this list called the Carbon Underground, and the hashtag that went with this was keep it in the ground. So these 200 companies need to keep the coal, oil, and gas reserves in the ground. And how do you do that? Well, you put pressure on them by publicly divesting and calling them out. So that's the argument, or that's the narrative argument, or that's the scope of the narrative. Now, how do we tackle this analytically? Well, first of all, I will show you in the paper, we track the Go Fossil Fuel Divestment movement, so the movement that's sprung from this 2012 Rolling Stone magazine article. We track the divestment pledges, so who divests, what's the cumulative count, and how many Twitter accounts do these people have, and then we looked at the stock price impact. And we look at three groups, so the Carbon Underground 200 that were targeted directly by the movement. But then we also look at other fossil fuel companies, because if I asked you now who's on the Carbon Underground 200 list and who is not, but is a fossil fuel companies, you would have a hard time distinguishing this. And that's why we also look at potential impact on that second group. But then, very importantly, we look at a third group, which are companies in other industries like cement that have very high carbon emissions, but that were not directly targeted by the divestment movement. So the divestment movement is not targeting divestment from cement companies. So if it is about engagement or if it is about price pressure, we should not observe any price reaction as that results from the activities of the movement in the cement or airlines industry. But if it's about a moral outrage narrative that has broader impact, we should see a price reaction, because people will factor in that there is actually a new risk stemming from the movement, from the pressure put by the movement, also for these other high carbon emitters. So what does the movement look like? Well, we started by just tracking the nodes of this movement, and then we used an iterative method to find them all. So where did we start? Well, we started from 350.org. As I said, 350.org has got 350.org because of 350 ppm, very good name. And then, of course, we also wanted important individuals associated with the movement, like Bill McKibben, who is not using that in 350 in his handle, but he mentions it in his description, so we included those. And then the fossil fuel divestment movement is a project of 350.org. So they use two types of handles: divest some institution or fossil free some institution. So divest Harvard is an example, and fossil free Yale is another example. So how many of these do we have? Well, I'll show you some numbers. So the first question is, this movement, how many nodes on Twitter does it actually contain? We count 504. We also found out that they're highly connected, so reciprocity is there, transitivity is there. And these are the most central nodes in the movement. Centrality in network analysis is defined, for example, by saying, is the node included in the shortest path between any of the nodes in the network. And if you take that, if you rank, like in this table by that, NYU, so this is New York University, divest, and that's the most central node, most connected to the other nodes, divest Harvard, not surprisingly, fossil-free MIT, and of course 350. Now note, these nodes are nodes about Twitter accounts or movements that target a particular institution with the aim to have that institution divest. But you will note on the slide that there are also some others. So there is Divest DE, which is Divest Deutschland, which is Divest Germany. So this is about divestment in Germany more generally, UK divest, 350 Australia. So these are broader accounts that are not just targeting one particular institution. How many of these handles do you have over time? I said 504, but what was the growth rate? So you can see here that 60% of them were added between 2013 and 2018. And please remember those 2 years, because that's going to matter later when I talk about net zero pledges by countries. So most of it was added by 2018. What hashtags does the movement use? Well, not surprisingly, Go Fossil Free nodes use the hashtag divest, divestment fossil free, and 350 does as well. But note, that's not the only hashtags they use, because the movement is about fossil free more generally. So it's about climate change, keep it in the ground. And then they also, for example, No XL or Stop Adani. This is about stopping particular fossil fuel projects. So on the one hand, broader hashtags about climate change, but then very specifically about divestment and fossil free. So how many tweets has the movement put out? Well, cumulatively between tweets 400,000 and then with tweets, retweets 800,000. Now that's just the tweets and the retweets, but as you know, the question is then how many people have potentially seen them. So this is not just the number of tweets and retweets, but actually the number of followers that the retweeters have, and that's what I'm going to use in a little while to define virality. So let's now move to the fossil fuel divestment pledges database and track that. So who are the institutions that have made divestment pledges and what's the impact from the pledges? So first of all, who has made pledges? So this is a screenshot from the divestment database. So at the top, you again see the number of divesting institutions. But note here, the movement has put you logos of institutions that have made divestment pledges on the website. And if you note, well, you might not recognize all of them. So you, of course, recognize the Ford Foundation, Harvard University, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, University of Oxford. But of course, you might notice here this particular thing. So this is actually outdated. This is Her Majesty the Queen Elizabeth. This is now King Charles. And this is the Pope. This is the Vatican. Okay, so they've made divestment pledges. Now, don't ask me what the value is of the Pope's portfolio. It actually is not that relevant. What really seems to matter here is what's the prestige of the Pope and of Her Majesty the Queen. So that's really the reason why they are being put here, not because they've divested a very large amount of fossil fuel. Now note, the state of Maine is also here. That's because, and the New York City, because of course it's actually important whether government or sovereign or cities or regions actually made divestment pledges as well. So to hammer this to give you a further illustration of this argument that it's the prestige that matters, this is actually a campaign that has not been successful yet, which is about divesting the Nobel Prize Foundation. Nobel, of course, left an endowment, and the Nobel Prize Foundation, the Nobel Foundation invests that money, and this is a campaign to get them to divest. And it's had more than 150,000 signatures. And they explain very well why they want the Nobel Foundation to divest. And they're not talking about price pressure. they are talking about the Nobel Prize Foundation, the Nobel Foundation being a very prestigious institution. So let's then go and have a look at the evolution over time of the database. So these are the pledges over time. So cumulatively, I told you before that it's 1,552, but when you look at the database, you can't find dates for all these pledges. So we could find dates for about half of them, and then we can plot the evolution. So you can see it's gradually, it's just basically linearly increased over time, these pledges, probably with an acceleration towards the end. Now, who has made them? I showed you before the kind of institutions that are being highlighted, but this is a list of the earliest ones. So it's faith institutions and educational institutions that made divestment pledges first in 2011. Now, who tweets most about this? The Guardian Media Group has been very important, but then you have Trocaire, Harvard University, University of Cambridge, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. There are some asset managers too, but if you look down the list, the most active ones here are actually, or the ones that are mentioned most by the movement, it's them tweeting and being mentioned. It's the prestige institutions that matter more than the asset managers. So this is the tweets and the number of tweets and the number of retweets. But what we are actually interested in is Schiller's measure, which is this viral or not viral? And the way we measure virality is how many tweets have there been, how many retweets, but then how many followers do the people who've retweeted actually have? And using that in combination, we define virality, and we find that there are 231 days where the movement or the divestment pledges from these institutions that were targeted by the movement went viral. Now, has that had an effect on stock prices? So we check that, and we do it for these three groups I mentioned. And the surprise is that, well, they're not, for me at least, they're not so big surprise, but should be for the people who think that divestment is not effective. There was an impact on these viral days for both the carbon underground and the fossil fuel companies. But remarkably, there's also been a small impact on companies beyond the fossil free, so the cements and the airline industries of the world. Now note, this is very consistent with Bolton and Koperchik, who note or who find that there is now a carbon premium that people ask from high carbon emitters. And that, of course, includes all carbon emitters, not just the fossil-free companies. So why is the movement having an impact? Well, that is still an argument. We need to still have a regression, but the argument basically is it's got to do with the reaction that we've now had from governments. So this gives you the list of not companies, not regions, not cities, but sovereign states, countries that have made divestment pledges. And you could see that it started 2014, but the really, shall we say, pledge that made a big difference was in 2018 from Sweden, because Sweden put this into law, which is, of course, a commitment device. So if you look at why this is important, well, it's important because we will have to at least the carbon budget, we have to basically get within budget by 2040, or otherwise we cannot meet the 1.5 degrees goal, which is, of course, what the whole discussion in Egypt was about. Now, other countries have made pledges. So you can see here, European Union, the various member states in the European Union, Canada, South Korea, but also Japan. So Japan has committed by law to come to net zero by 2050, same as South Korea. South Korea is also 2050, about net zero by 2050. So that's remarkable, and that was not maybe what people had expected when the movement was started in 2012. Now, That brings me to the summary and the conclusion. So I hope I've convinced you that the fossil fuel divestment pledge movement is not about downward sloping demand curves for stocks. It's not about voting at shareholder meetings, but it's a narrative, it's a social movement. And these are basically moral outrage statements from these institutions. And they say this is so important that we actually don't want to have anything to do with this activity that's destroying the planet. I hope I've also shown you evidence, well, I have shown you evidence that this has impact on stock prices, which is consistent with the evidence we now have from the asset pricing literature, which then brings me to the final argument, which is that today, if you look at this, it's no longer just a movement that is about moral outrage, but it's actually become a self-fulfilling prophecy, because if you believe that these countries are serious about net zero, well, we cannot get all the carbon that's in the ground out of the ground, so we cannot have the same carbon emissions that we have today. So we've got to decarbonize, and these companies have to decarbonize, and the valuations that we have today in stock markets basically say that people will be able to extract and emit all these carbon emissions. So something has to give. Now, if you believe that countries are serious about their pledges and that the outrage movement will continue to help countries to keep with their pledges, you should actually make a pledge, you should announce as any kind of risk-averse investor to divest from fossil fuels. And there are, of course, ways in which you can do that. So Japan, let me finish 1 minute with Japan. I looked at Japan, and as I said, Japan has enshrined net zero by 2050 by law. There are only two asset managers that you can find in the divestment database. So student movement, I couldn't see anything. So why are students not more engaged on this in Japan? And there are, of course, numerous very prestigious institutions that could be targeted. So you can think yourself which are the institutions that would be the equivalent of the royal household and the Pope. I understand the emperor does not have a personal endowment, so he can probably not make a divestment pledge, but something that comes close to that. And then in any case, as I've argued, if you think that the Japanese government is serious and the other governments are serious by going to net zero, you should actually make a conditional divestment pledge, no matter what investor you are, even if you don't believe that there's a moral argument to be had here. Thank you very much.